Hi, good evening. Good evening, everybody. It's great to see you all. My name is Janice Kaminer-Resnick. David Lehrer, who I'll introduce to you in a moment, and I are honored to welcome you to the fifth program in our virtual series, America at a Crossroad. We give special welcome tonight to the several hundred people on with us for whom this is your first visit to our series. It's great to have you with us. Today is an especially disturbing day for our country. Today marks the day on which the COVID-19 virus claimed its 100,000th American victim. We are mindful of the horror of that number and would like to dedicate tonight's program to the memory of those whose lives have been claimed by this vicious disease. And because Judge, Jews United for Democracy and Justice, one of the sponsors of tonight's program, is a Jewish organization, it cannot go unmentioned that tomorrow begins the Jewish festival of Shavuot, the holiday which celebrates the moment when the Israelites were wandering in the desert, that they gathered at the base of Mount Sinai and received the Torah, thus turning the Israelites into the Jewish people. It is said that every Jew throughout history was at the base of Mount Sinai that day to receive the 5 books of Moses. And it is said that that is the idea that unifies Jewish people through time and space. The holiday is dedicated to the study of Torah. The late Rabbi Harold Schulweis always spoke about the importance of including the current events of the day as an overlay onto the Torah, just as he said that the most important structural component of a synagogue is the window, to let the world in and to enable us to engage in that world. So we are very happy to be kicking off this holiday with this important study session tonight. This virtual series is part of a larger program called Community Conversations, which over the last 2.5 years has brought almost 20 programs of excellent quality to the community. Community Conversations is a joint venture of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., 2 organizations dedicated to preserving our democracy, which we feel is under serious threat. David Lehrer, my partner in crime, is former regional ADL director and the founder of and president of Community Advocates, Inc., and is also on our Jews United steering committee. Aside from David and me, our Jews United steering committee includes Zev Yaroslavsky, Mel Levine, and Carolyn Kelly. Co-sponsors of these virtual programs are Valley Beth Shalom, Leo Beck Temple, Stephen Wise Temple, Ikar, Temple Israel of Hollywood, Jewish Center for Justice, and The Forward, the newspaper. These synagogues and organizations do not endorse any points of view or any political ideology. Rather, they have agreed to co-sponsor to expose their congregants to ideas espoused by renowned journalists and thinkers. Many thanks to our funders, and if you would like to become a funder, please just send a note to me. You can just reply to any email that I send you. And I know we send you a lot, especially on the day of a program, to ensure that everybody gets the Zoom link. And then I'll tell you how to make your tax-deductible donation. Be sure to turn your volume up because the speakers have no control over the volume of their microphone. So if you can't hear, it's going to be fixed on your end with your volume control. I'd now like to present David Lehrer.
Thank you, Janice. I'm pleased to join you in welcoming everyone to America at a Crossroads virtual town hall. We're very proud of these programs that have presented an extraordinary array of speakers. Next week, we will host the New York Times op-ed columnist David Brooks, who will be joined by our own Warren Alney. That will be followed by 2 of the Atlantic magazine's leading lights, David Frum and Peter Beinart, with KCRW's Madeline Brand moderating. Then we will have 2 of the nation's top scholars in the field of law, UC Berkeley's Dean Erwin Chemerinsky and UCLA Law School Dean Jennifer Mnookin, discussing the Constitution in crisis with the LA Times' Henry Weinstein. And we've just added 2 new programs this week that are timely and relevant as those already scheduled. On June 17, we will host LA Mayor Eric Garcetti to discuss the financial and related challenges now faced by our city. 2 days ago, the New York Times described California as being in economic freefall as a result of the COVID pandemic. The mayor will be in dialogue with Jim Newton, editor-at-large of the LA Times. And on July 1st, the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt, will address the topic of anti-Semitism, bigotry, and hate in the age of Trump. If bigotry and extremism are on your list of concerns, this is a program you won't want to miss. I will be asking Jonathan questions about these and related issues. A reminder, you will be able to pose questions using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen over the next hour. However, with an audience exceeding 1,100 registrants, we can't guarantee that your question will be asked. We'll try. Max Boot is a historian, best-selling author, and foreign policy analyst. He's been called, quote, one of the world's leading authorities on armed conflict by the Institute for Strategic Studies. He's the Jean J. Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a columnist for the Washington Post and an analyst for CNN. One of the two books he released in 2018 was titled The Corrosion of Conservatism. It has been described as a devastating dissection of conservatism's degeneracy in America. That's a quote. Our moderator is Pat Morrison, a multiple Emmy and Golden Mike winning fixture in LA television, radio, and print. KCET, KPCC, and the LA Times have all featured Pat prominently as a unique voice in and about our community. She's the author of several books, most recently, Don't Stop the Presses, Truth, Justice, and the American Newspaper. She even has a Pink's hot dog named after her, the Pat Morrison Baja Veggie. As Pat told me, it's even better than an Emmy. Pat?
David, thanks so much. And all of you know that David is a most remarkable public servant and has been for decades in this city, an important voice and the kind of figure we need more of. So David, thank you, and Janice as well, for all that you do for Los Angeles. Well, some of you may remember a couple of years ago when Max and I were on stage. I believe we were at the Skirball, and the title of this particular series that we're doing, America at a Crossroads, is Assessing the Trump Administration. Where does it rank and why? And back then, Max said that there were enough never-Trumpers, former Republicans, for a dinner party, but not for a political party. And so I suppose that's a good beginning to ask, laying the groundwork for the remarks you're going to hear for him first before he and I talk together, and then after that, take your questions. So Max, product of LA, take it away.
Well, thanks very much, Pat, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you, even if it's virtual. I look forward to actually coming back in person to my hometown of LA. And, picking up on the point you made about never-Trumpers, I would say actually, we spoke before the 2018 election, and I would say the 2018 election revealed that there are actually more never-Trumpers, even if they don't necessarily think of themselves that way, than I had anticipated prior to 2018, certainly enough to deliver control of the House of Representatives to the Democrats with a pretty big majority. Now, the issue that I've been asked to address today by our sponsors is assessing the Trump presidency at this point. And I think this was sparked by something that I wrote 7 weeks ago when I wrote a column for the Washington Post headlined, "The Worst President Ever." And I've never been a fan of Donald Trump, but my lack of appreciation for him has plunged to new lows in the last few months. I wrote this at the beginning of April, and it's daunting just to think about how far we've come in the wrong direction since then. Back then, the United States was already the world leader in coronavirus cases, confirmed cases, but we still had only, and I use only in air quotes, something like 9,400 fatalities, and only, again, air quotes, something like 9 million unemployed. Now, 7 weeks later, we have just passed, as Janet noted, that grim milestone of 100,000 dead people. And I might add, we also have something like 36 million people who have filed unemployment claims in the last 3 months. This is a catastrophe, the likes of which I think none of us have ever seen, because this is really a combination of the economic impact of a Great Depression coming at the same time as the body count of the Vietnam and Korean Wars, but it's all telescoped into 3 months. Remember the Korean War, the Vietnam War, they lasted for years. The Great Depression lasted for years. All of this is basically happening at warp speed in the course of 3 months. It's just a staggering catastrophe. And I don't think it had to be this way. Obviously, it wouldn't matter who was president. We were still going to hit by the corona. We were still going to be hit by the coronavirus. We were still going to have dead Americans. We were still going to have unemployed Americans. No question, this would be a very hard blow to our country. But it did not have to be this hard. And think about the fact that South Korea and the United States, we both had our first coronavirus cases confirmed on the same day in January. Today, South Korea has about 270 dead. 270. We have more than 100,000. Or, look at countries like Germany or Canada, which have a fraction of our body count, not only in absolute numbers, but also in terms of a percentage of population. This is just a calamity, the likes of which I think nobody could have anticipated. And I think the reason it's a calamity, and the reason why I wrote at the beginning of April that Donald Trump was already the worst president in US history, is because I believe he is largely responsible for the scale of the suffering that has been inflicted upon the United States in the last few months. However much he may try to blame the WHO or China or somebody else, it's ultimately Donald Trump that's responsible. I mean, if you Google the timeline of events and you read articles in papers like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, it's utterly horrifying, because Donald Trump was informed in early January that the coronavirus was a threat, that it was sweeping through Wuhan province and it was going to spread around the world. And he wasn't paying attention because basically he doesn't read his intelligence briefings. He doesn't listen to what the intelligence community tells him. But he was also told this by Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, and many others, and he refused to believe it. For 2 months, he was in complete denial, and he would say things like, it's under control, it's like a miracle, soon it'll be gone. He predicted that it would be over by April. Just this amazing ability to ignore reality and to live in this alternative reality bubble that he always inhabits. And so because of that failure on the part of Donald Trump to take this seriously, the United States fell fatally far behind in testing, in tracing, in quarantining, doing all those things that countries that got it right. Countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Germany, many others, they've done this right. We've done it wrong. We're suffering much more than they are as a result. Just a colossal failure on the part of the federal government that was not at all inevitable. And the problem is that once the coronavirus got out of control, as it did by mid-March, there's no way to unscramble this omelet, because the rate of growth is exponential. And so as a result of that, we all had to go into this lockdown, which has now lasted months, and which has inflicted staggering economic damage on the country. But there was really no alternative, because this is the only way to get any control on this virus. And while we have all been sheltering and dealing as best we can with these horrifying events, what has Donald Trump been doing? He's been touting miracle cures. He's been touting this anti-malaria drug that he claims can somehow prevent coronavirus, even though the studies now show that it can actually increase your risk of a deadly outcome. He's been engaging in flirting with conspiracy theories about how this was started in a Chinese lab. He's been defunding the World Health Organization in the middle of a global pandemic, which is the equivalent of injecting bleach to fight coronavirus, which, by the way, is one of the remedies that he suggested. The President of the United States suggested we inject bleach, disinfectant, to fight coronavirus. And you know what makes this truly astonishing? That wasn't even the craziest thing that he said lately. It is hard to top the fact that in the last few days in particular, I mean, this has been going on for a while, but in the last few days, he's doubled down on accusing Joe Scarborough, the MSNBC morning host, of murdering one of his former congressional aides, a poor woman who died as a result of a heart problem, hit her head, fell, and died of an accident. And Donald Trump is dredging this up and concocting this insane, sick, deranged conspiracy theory, which is inflicting great emotional suffering on the family of this poor woman. And he doesn't care, because he will say or do anything to get at his critics like Joe Scarborough. And while he is pursuing his personal vendettas, he is showing no empathy, no ability to bring the country together. He continues to divide us. He says almost nothing about the suffering that's been going on. Instead, he's been using this as an opportunity to brag about his TV ratings. He is delighted that he's getting great TV ratings for his press conferences, which is, the sign of severe narcissism in action. And just all of his psychological tics that we have seen for years, they've all been on display. None of them have gone away, but they've all become much more deadly. The solipsism, the irrationality, the conspiracy mongering, the lack of leadership, the desire to divide the country, all of these things have been on display in the last few months, and the effect has been deadlier than ever before. The result has been this unprecedented catastrophe. And that's why I said as long as 7 weeks ago that, move over James Buchanan. We have a new contender for the worst president in our history. And I certainly stand by that because the situation has actually gotten far worse in the last 7 weeks.
Max, thank you. I guess that Trump can master time and space because I hadn't remembered that we talked before the election. I thought we had talked after the election. But before we talk about your most recent piece in the Washington Post, I want to pursue the question of the COVID-19 response. Donald Trump has refused to wear a mask. He thinks it's unmanly. I have called on Twitter Mike Pence No Mask Mike because he's emulating Donald Trump in this. And there was a piece in the Atlantic going after Donald Trump, who in turn went after the Atlantic as both boring and nasty, which was an unusual combination. But it said that Trump is this cartoon of manliness and masculinity, and that this is what he's trying to project, that as if he were invulnerable to the virus. And I want you to talk a little bit about the base that appeals to, because there's a small percentage, maybe larger this time, of the population that naturally we're going to struggle over for the 2020 election. That's the battleground. But who are the people who are sticking with Trump even through potentially deadly medical suggestions from the White House, even through the idea that I don't need to wear a mask because nothing is happening to me? What is that percentage of the population, and why are they supporting him as they do?
Well, the polls show that about 75, something like that, percent of the population, roughly 2/3 of the population or more, believes in wearing masks, believes in social distancing, believes in the lockdown. All of that is necessary, but that leaves the other 25 or 30% of the population which does not. And by the way, by coincidence or not, 25 to 30% of the population is also Donald Trump's hardcore support. That is his rock solid, true believing, deplorable MAGA base. And I would suspect that most of those people are the ones who treat the coronavirus with contempt and don't take it seriously, as Donald Trump does not take it seriously. In fact, I saw there was a interview on TV with some kid, I think in the Ozarks, who was partying with his pals, not wearing a mask, not practicing social distancing, and he was quoted as saying, "Hey, if President Trump doesn't wear a mask, why should I?" I mean, this is crazy. I mean, the reason Trump doesn't wear a mask, or he can get away with not wearing a mask, is because he's tested every single day, and everybody who comes in contact with him is tested every single day. So he is relatively safe, but he is setting a terrible, horrible example. And I think the reason why he refuses to wear a mask is to do so would be to acknowledge his failure, his shame, the fact that this disease has gotten out of control. And he refuses to admit that. Even while he's acquiesced to social distancing and lockdowns and all the rest of it, he really hates it. He really wants to pretend that this has not happened. And from the start, he's been pretending that the situation is great. It's about to go away. The economy will come roaring back. None of that has been true. Now, eventually it will be true, but he is just in a constant state of denial. And I'm afraid that a lot of his followers are there with him. And I would note that Trump and a lot of the base of the Republican Party are also climate deniers. They reject the science of climate change. And I think they have a tendency to look down upon all experts because they're populists. They have contempt for elites, people who actually know things like scientists and doctors. And so they're pretty consistent. They have contempt for higher learning. They have contempt for expertise. They have contempt for science. And that carries over into the present case. But now I think it's more deadly than ever because, most of the time, if they believe some crackpot conspiracy theory, that's their problem. But if they don't believe that coronavirus is a serious threat, if they don't believe in wearing masks, and if at a time when we get a vaccine, if they refuse to take the vaccine, that's not their problem, or not their problem alone. That's our problem because they are putting the public health at risk.
what about his elected enablers? You mentioned the Joe Scarborough conspiracy theory, which has brought out his wrath because Twitter is fact-checking him on this. But there are a very few Republicans who are edging toward the exits on some of these things. Liz Cheney today, Mitt Romney, a few others who are saying, we don't want to go there. I mean, why do you have still the loyalty of a Ted Cruz, about whose father Donald Trump implied that he helped Lee Harvey Oswald assassinate JFK? Where are the elected Republicans in this? And are they asking themselves at this point, what price, the judiciary, what trade-off are we paying to have a Donald Trump in the White House for the things we wanted him to accomplish?
Yeah, if you're talking about principled elected Republicans in Washington, I think you're basically talking a party of one. Mitt Romney, the only member of either chamber in the Republican Party to vote for impeachment, and who has been pretty consistent in calling out Trump. Now you're just seeing this utterly shameful and degrading spectacle where Donald Trump is literally talking like a madman, just propagating lunatic theories about Joe Scarborough, and most of the Republicans are afraid to challenge him. I mean, Kevin McCarthy of California was asked about this wacko nutcase conspiracy theory, and he refused to shoot it down. He basically avoided the topic because he doesn't want to incur Donald Trump's wrath. And I think that is basically where almost the entire Republican Party is right now. They're afraid of Donald Trump, and they have come so far with him over the course of the last 3+ years. They basically feel like their fate is tied to his. They don't want to incur his wrath and displeasure. And you're seeing his vindictiveness right now. For example, he keeps lashing out at poor Jeff Sessions because he holds a grudge against Jeff Sessions for following the law and recusing himself from the special counsel investigation into Trump and Russia. And so Trump has never forgiven that and is now actively tweeting to try to defeat Sessions in the Alabama Senate primary as we speak. And all these other Republicans, see how vindictive, cruel, and irrational Trump is, and what a connection he has with his most fervent base. And so they're terrified to cross him. This to me is really a disgrace. And I would hope, one of the things I wrote after Joe Biden secured the nomination is, I would hope if there are any rational, responsible Republicans out there, current or former elected officials, former cabinet officers, people in senior ranks in the Republican Party, I would hope that they would have the guts to do this time what they didn't have the guts to do in 2016, which is to endorse the Democratic candidate, because Joe Biden does not carry any of Hillary Clinton's baggage. And I say that as somebody who voted for Hillary Clinton, but a lot of Republicans think that Hillary Clinton had a lot of baggage. Well, Joe Biden does not. He's got no emails that he needs to cover up. He's a moderate guy. They know him. He's been around Washington for years. So I would hope that they would have the guts to say what I know that they feel in their heart, which is that Joe Biden would be a far, far better president than the one that we have right now.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the political landscape and get back to Biden. The political landscape apropos of the House and Senate, because in 2018, Republicans who were endorsed by Trump, a lot of them lost their seats, both in the Senate and in the House. So is there a price that they are going to pay, given that in 2018, you had some anti-Trump fervor that was coming out and expressing itself in congressional races? Now you've got a ticket that from the top is going to be an opportunity for people to say, this is not what we want. So the trade-offs look a little uneasy, I would think, for Republicans, especially when this cycle does not favor Republicans in the Senate.
I think that's right. And you're seeing very alarming poll numbers for a lot of Republicans seeking re-election in states like North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Maine, and elsewhere. So there is certainly the potential for a wave election that will sweep a lot of them out of power and sweep in Democrats in both chambers as well as in the White House. But I just want to inject a note of caution here, because we should not count our election results before they are hatched. And I think Jason Furman, who was one of President Obama's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, I think he has a very trenchant and timely warning that we should all heed, because right now, Republicans are doing pretty poorly in the polls because we're, having the worst unemployment since the Great Depression, horrible, horrific numbers, as well as obviously this horrible, horrific death toll. But what Jason Furman warns us is that you could well see a V-shaped recovery in the third quarter. This isn't guaranteed, but it's certainly possible. after having record-setting job losses in the last few months, we could be seeing record-setting job gains heading into the November election. And there's even the possibility, and I certainly hope that this will come to pass, that we will see the rollout of a vaccine by November. It's certainly not, I don't know that I would bet on it, but it's certainly a real possibility. And so you can imagine what Donald Trump is going to say if we still have 10, 12% unemployment, but we're adding jobs very rapidly on a weekly and monthly basis. And if all of a sudden a lot of people are being inoculated against the coronavirus, he's going to claim that he's been phenomenally successful, he's done a great job, and that you should reelect him. And I think that argument will resonate with some people. I think it's certainly going to be hard for him to win in the current environment because nobody thinks we're going to have a complete economic recovery by November. But if the trajectory is a positive one, it is possible that he could still squeak out another narrow electoral college majority. So that's, I don't mean to depress anybody about the political prospects, but I think we certainly have to be cognizant of that and can't take for granted what the outcome of the November election is, because a lot of people, including me, bet against Trump the first time around, and I certainly don't want to repeat that error this time.
Another of the arguments he's trotting out, because he's not very good at talking about substance unless he's looking at his ratings or market numbers, and when those aren't good, he won't talk about them. But now he's saying we're sending out 50,000 poll watchers. Here we have election fraud all over again. Vote by mail, which he has done, which his press secretary has done about a dozen times. It is fraudulent, and they're sending ballots to everybody in California. I'm waiting for my dog to get a ballot if that's the case. But he's up there lying about how vote by mail actually works, and obviously poisoning the waters about that before the November election.
Yeah, I mean, this is something Republicans have been doing since the 1960s, since they basically switched positions with the Democratic Party and became the party of white opposition to civil rights. And ever since then, Republicans have been trying to suppress the minority vote. And that's what this is about. I mean, it's ludicrous to think that we need 50,000 poll watchers to stop electoral fraud, because all of the academic studies show that there is basically no electoral fraud in this country. It is not an issue. But those 50,000 poll watchers that Trump and his campaign and the RNC, what they're putting together, basically designed to intimidate minority voters, make it harder for them to vote, because they understand that this election is going to come down to a squeaker outcome in a handful of swing states. And if they can just suppress the numbers among African Americans who are overwhelmingly anti-Trump, it's possible that Trump could again pull out another very narrow electoral college victory. And so it's really a disgrace and a shame what is happening. The Republican Party is really engaging in wholesale racism and targeting of minority voters, but Republicans don't really care about that. And my column today was actually about the Republican indifference to the racism that we see in this country, which is revealed, in this horrible act of police brutality in Minneapolis, and this horrible shooting in Georgia, and many other examples. And Republicans,
the Amy Cooper privilege example in Central Park, where she could have gotten a man killed.
Exactly. And Republican outrage is firmly in check. They've basically become the anti-racism party. They basically mock and denigrate anybody who suggests that we have a problem with racism, and they deploy all of these cute epithets on Fox News about social justice warriors and cancel culture and woke people and all this kind of stuff, basically to denigrate anybody who suggests that we have a problem with racism. But in fact, we do have a problem with racism, and Donald Trump is Exhibit A.
Then let's talk about the political landscape, because I think that never Trumpers were very relieved when Joe Biden got enough votes for the nomination. And it means that a lot of people who might not have voted otherwise or might have voted for third party would be comfortable voting for Joe Biden in the way they would not have been comfortable perhaps for voting for Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders in this go-round cycle. So now the question then becomes vice presidential running mate, which seems an inconsequential question, but it's consequential for the Democrats, because as Joe Biden is a centrist, they need to look to the Sanders voters, they need to look to the feelings, the sentiments that created that Sanders support, even if it wasn't enough to get Sanders the nomination, and certainly to the role that Black women voters played in getting Joe Biden that nomination.
I mean, I'm certainly one of those people who was very relieved when Joe Biden got the nomination. And there was a period there, a few weeks, when I was just very alarmed, thinking that Bernie Sanders was going to win after Iowa and New Hampshire, which I think would have been a catastrophe. Even though I said I would have voted for him, yeah, I think a lot of people would not have. And he would have had a hard time picking up centrist support and making a Trump victory much more likely. Biden is a much more formidable adversary. And we know that because of the way that Trump himself has acted. I mean, remember, he got himself impeached last year, trying to smear Joe Biden, trying to get Ukraine to impugn him. And now they're really, throwing everything they could possibly can against Biden in this supreme act of projection. Everything that Trump is accused of, including racism, sexual assault, kowtowing to China, incoherence, babbling, all these things, Trump is now accusing Biden of, even though there's far more evidence that Trump himself is guilty of these offenses. So clearly Biden worries Trump and the Republican Party, and I think for good reason, because it's very hard to caricature good old Uncle Joe Biden as being some kind of left-wing socialist nutcase who is going to, flood the country with immigrants and take your money and all that kind of stuff, because Biden has been a kind of mainstream centrist figure in Washington for decades. And so I'm very comfortable supporting him. As I said, I hope some other current or former Republicans will be comfortable supporting him. In terms of the vice presidency, I mean, I think he has some fine options, including Senator Harris, including Senator Klobuchar. I think obviously those are the two leading candidates. I think either one of those would be totally fine. If I were Biden, I would not obsess about the electoral impact of the VP slot, because generally the electoral impact is pretty slim to none. But he should certainly get somebody that he would feel comfortable running with and governing with, and somebody that he would feel comfortable succeeding him. And I think that's what President Obama did in choosing Joe Biden. And I think, Biden, I expect, will approach this selection with the same degree of seriousness.
What about this attack on Obama? We know that he spent his entire administration, Trump, trying to undo anything that has Barack Obama's name on it. But now they're talking about criminal charges, and some person from this crazy new right-wing network asked at a White House press conference, is President Trump considering pardoning Barack Obama? For what? What is this going to play? We know it plays with his base, but if he's trying to reach out beyond that, President Obama is still pretty popular.
Yeah, I don't think this plays much beyond his base. This is basically Operation Distraction, because Trump doesn't have much to say about the fact that we've lost 100,000 Americans, we've lost 36 million jobs, and so he's trying to talk about something else, including this entirely imaginary scandal that he has concocted. Obamagate is basically a slogan in search of a scandal, because there is no there. Even Trump himself was asked, what laws do you think that President Obama broke? And his reply was, well, you know what laws, everybody knows what laws, everybody except the readers of your newspaper, which is the Washington Post. But Trump himself can't actually say what happened wrong. Certainly the unmasking of Mike Flynn in surveillance transcripts, there's nothing improper about that. And it's not even clear that he was actually unmasked when you examine it more closely. This is basically just, McCarthyism on steroids, trying to claim that there is some kind of vast left-wing deep state conspiracy against them that involves the entire Obama administration, the FBI, the CIA. Pretty soon he's going to be including, the Pope and the Queen of England, and
I think that's Lyndon LaRouche.
Lyndon, yeah, I mean, this is like Lyndon LaRouche territory. But this guy is actually president of the United States. And again, I would say this Obamagate stuff is the craziest thing he's ever said. But then, he's advocated injecting bleach. He's accused Joe Scarborough of murder. So you can never say this is like the craziest thing ever, because he will say something crazier the following day.
Your column of a couple of days ago talked about the incident in the presidential debate where Hillary Clinton says that Putin would like a puppet as the president of the United States, and Trump burst out into this playground, I'm rubber, you're glue, no puppet, you're the puppet. And I remember listening to it and thinking, how can anybody think this man is presidential timber? But how do you account, as you write about this, as Joe Biden is such a counter to Trump, how is it that nothing sticks to him? We talked about Reagan as the Teflon president. I don't know what substance it is that deflects all the stuff that Donald Trump has incoming at him.
It is astonishing, and I think a lot of it just has to do with the fact that perceptions are so hardened about Trump, with about 55% of the country can't stand him, about 42% likes him pretty well, and those numbers essentially have not budged since he took office. It's kind of amazing that we were there before the coronavirus, we were there after the coronavirus. All the other leaders in the world, basically, and all of our governors have gotten massive poll boosts from the coronavirus, but not Trump. He has basically stayed pretty flat, and he's got his base, and that's who he appeals to. He runs his entire presidency is basically premised on a base mobilization strategy, and he makes really no attempt to reach out to anybody else. His strategy was vindicated in 2016. I didn't think it would be. Like you, I thought, oh my goodness. I mean, who could possibly imagine that this guy should be elected president with these juvenile playground insults, basically like, I know what you are, but what am I? I mean, that's his level of discourse, but that actually works for a disturbing number of people, I would say. It certainly mobilizes his base. And ultimately, I think, a lot of this stuff we've gotten kind of used to his crazy style, and, things that he does every single day would have been weeks of headlines with any other president, would have destroyed any other presidency. But with Trump, it's just like that's today, and he's going to do something even crazier tomorrow.
Well, and that's the last question I want to get to before I get to the viewers' questions, and that is he's creating so much chaff and distraction that we aren't seeing the fundamental, very dangerous things going on. Constitutional undermining, for example, gutting the professionals in the government, in the executive branch of the government, and replacing them with toadies and sycophants.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think the pattern with Trump is that his bigger disasters deflect attention from his smaller disasters. And right now, of course, the overriding disaster is the coronavirus. And he's been taking advantage of this situation to do things like firing one inspector general after another, removing the safeguards on abuse of office. His attorney general, Bill Barr, who is the most partisan attorney general, I think, in modern history, has been trying to drop charges against his former national security advisor, Mike Flynn, trying to go easy on his crony, Roger Stone, doing all sorts of things to curry favor with Trump, which are utterly repugnant, and no previous president would engage in this kind of behavior. But Trump is doing it, and he's getting away with it. I mean, just this week we had Rick Grinnell step down as acting director of national intelligence, and his very brief tenure was an utter disgrace because he released this information about Mike Flynn, basically pursuing a Trump partisan agenda, not the nonpartisan national agenda that we expect of a director of national intelligence. But who the heck is paying attention to what Rick Grinnell is doing? And you're seeing this pretty consistently across the government. Steve Bannon, who was Trump's Svengali at one point, spoke about deconstructing the administrative state. And that is basically what Trump is doing. He is deconstructing the state. He is putting his cronies and sycophants into positions of authority in all the key departments, whether it's Department of State, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, Director of National Intelligence, you name it. He is driving out the professionals, the whistleblowers, the inspector generals, anybody who can serve as a check on his abuse of authority. That's why it's really terrifying to imagine that he could potentially win a second term, because he has done already so much to undermine the norms of our government. I mean, can you imagine what he would do with another 4 years and what he would perceive as a mandate for re-election?
Please, things are hard enough. Let's go to some questions too, because, well, we know he's already cost us now our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honors. So let's see. Let me keep going down here and see what we've got, because I can see some. What actions, here's Judy wants to know, what actions might be taken by Democrats in Congress to shut down Trump's threat to social media platforms as he did today. It's a basic fundamental misunderstanding of the First Amendment.
Well, I think, yeah, I think that's right. And of course, he is incensed because Twitter has dared to fact check at least one of his incendiary and false claims, even though they still allow him to make many other incendiary and false claims, including his absolutely insane allegations against Joe Scarborough. And so Trump is now threatening to somehow regulate social media. His power to do that, I think, is pretty limited. I mean, if he tries to interfere with the operations of Twitter or Facebook or something like that, he's going to have a major First Amendment problem. I think the courts will get involved. So I'm not sure how much he can do, but he's certainly trying to do what he can. And one of the things that he's done during the coronavirus that has gotten almost no attention is he has replaced the Postmaster General, the person who runs the U.S. Postal Service, with a Republican donor. And now there's a completely Republican-dominated, Trump-dominated board. And that's important because Trump has a vendetta against my employer, the Washington Post. And the way he wants to strike back against the Washington Post is to strike back at our owner, Jeff Bezos, who of course is the founder of Amazon. And so Trump is determined to double, triple, even quadruple shipping rates for packages to try to hurt Amazon as a way to hurt the Washington Post. And the previous Postmaster General refused to go along, but the new one almost certainly will. So, you know, even given the First Amendment, the president still has a lot of power. And this is one of his many abuses against the free press, which doesn't get the attention that it deserves.
The post office is one of the rare American institutions that predates even the Declaration of Independence, thanks to Ben Franklin. Here's a question that's a strategy question that's an important one at many levels. This is from Joe Widoff, excuse me. How can the Biden campaign counter the fire hose of lies that come from Trump and his acolytes?
It's very hard. I mean, it's overwhelming, the amount of disinformation that comes out of the Trump White House. And I think it's almost impossible to shoot down every insane tweet, every incendiary and false ad. They have to do the best they can. I think they really need to be able to compete on social media. And I'm hoping that Mike Bloomberg will come through with all the money that he's promised for the Democratic campaign to allow Biden to compete on a more even playing surface on social media than Hillary Clinton was able to do in 2016. But, you know, ultimately, at the end of the day, I think Biden is being pretty smart because he's keeping his eye on the ball, which is the fact that you have 36 million unemployed Americans, you have more than 100,000 dead Americans, and Donald Trump is president. He is responsible for that. And I think Biden has really been hammering that with, you know, in his comments from his basement, as well as with his social media ads. And I think ultimately, I do think that much as Trump will try to distract us, ultimately, I think the election is going to be decided on the state of the country in November 2020, rather, sorry.
Lawrence is asking, I guess, for a mea culpa, that you've been a lifelong Republican. He's talking not just now about the 2016 election and Trump, but the Republican Party itself as something that has created what Lawrence sees as the problems, many of the problems we have now.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And I've issued a number of mea culpas, in particular in my book, The Corrosion of Conservatism, Why I Left the Right, where I really grapple with what the Republican Party really has been, and others have done as well. Stuart Stevens, the Republican veteran consultant, he has a new book coming out in August called It Was All a Lie. And I think, you know, Stuart and I have reached very similar conclusions, basically saying that, you know, we supported Republican candidates like Mitt Romney and John McCain and George Bush and others for what we regarded as fairly high-minded reasons. But in fact, a lot of people supported the Republican Party for very different reasons, because they were looking for the most racist party they could find. They were looking for a party that would appeal to their prejudice and bash people of color and, you know, undermine climate science and so forth. And that actually has been a huge portion of the Republican appeal. And that was something, until Trump came along, I have to admit, I was willfully blind to that, even though a lot of people on the left side of the spectrum had been saying that for years. I didn't believe them. Now I believe them, because, you know, Donald Trump has gone from dog whistling to wolf whistling, and, you know, his appeals to conspiracy mongering and and prejudice are, completely unmistakable. It's as if, the John Birch Society had taken over the entire Republican Party, and now what used to be the fringe has become the mainstream.
David has a question which is especially interesting in light of the fact that it's turned out that so many of the bots offering disinformation about COVID-19 are generated from Russia. His question is, what do you believe is the impact of current Russian attacks on the election? How much of what Trump and Republicans are saying comes from Russian intelligence and or Putin?
That's a great question. I mean, there is evidence certainly that Putin is interested in influencing this election after having already carried out arguably the most successful covert operation in history in 2016 to help elect Donald Trump. There is every reason to believe that Putin is going to try the same tactic again, and Donald Trump is going to welcome it. I mean, he was asked about this almost a year ago by George Stephanopoulos, and he was very honest. He said that if somebody, a foreign power intervened, he wouldn't say no, and he hasn't said no. In fact, he has demanded that intervention on the part of the Russians, on the part of the Ukrainians, goodness knows who else. And I think this is one of the things that really alarms me about the fact that you now have this conspiracy mongering Trump sycophant named John Ratcliffe, former congressman, who has been confirmed as director of national intelligence, because it's really the intelligence community that is our first line of defense against this kind of Russian operation. But Donald Trump has made sure that he has control of the intelligence community. So presumably they will not push back that hard or that publicly if there is a covert Russian campaign to help Donald Trump this time around. I think you're already seeing a few signs of that developing, and I think that is a very worrisome contingency for this election. I think the only advantage we have this time around is that we saw it happen last time, and so hopefully forewarned will be forearmed.
Here's a question from Alicia, really disappointed about Democrats that haven't been in the streets protesting this disgrace of a president. The situation were reversed. We know that the Republicans would fall in line and would be in the streets stopping commerce. Yes, we're in the middle of a pandemic, but why the passivity among Democrats?
Yeah, that's a fair point. There certainly has not been a revolt in the streets, no matter how revolting Donald Trump's words and conduct are. It has not caused the civil insurrection, which you might have expected to see, given actions like, locking children in cages, his openly racist rhetoric, so many of the other things that he has done that are so appalling and so inhumane. And I would say, in part that's because up until recently, we have had a fairly strong economy. And so, economic well-being is cushioned or, perhaps dissipated some of the anger that people might feel that they're not mobilizing because they feel pretty comfortable. And now they're not mobilizing, I would say, because for understandable reasons, most people don't want to go out. I mean, the people who are mobilizing now are some of these fringe freedom protesters who are emulating Tea Party tactics to protest these social lockdowns. But they're, a right-wing fringe. And obviously that's not an example that you would hope that most people would emulate.
The wonderful Judy Davidson has a question. She's terrified that Trump is going to press the nuclear button if he feels he's losing. And we've seen instances before of saber rattling, with him not just doing distraction, but doing things that have a sort of quasi-military feel, calling the students back, the cadets at West Point, to enable him to give a speech in the middle of the coronavirus epidemic, which is not pushing the nuclear button. But the concern is that if he feels pushed to the wall, he will do something extreme and dangerous and potentially self-destructive for all of us. Are you still with us, Max? Yes, sorry, go ahead.
Still there. Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right about what Donald will do if he's feeling desperate, if he's feeling like he's going to be losing. I mean, I would not expect that he's going to launch World War III to stay in office, including concocting, imaginary plots about illegal voters, using full authority of his office. And I think that is a terrifying contingency. Think about, and also think about, what happens if Trump loses, try to cling to office. He was cheated, that there was illegal voting, that he was going to succeed in that, but he can certainly, a major commotion, he can certainly get his protesters.
Although here we are, I think we may have frozen up and lost Max. Max, are you back with us?
Yeah, I'm there. Can you get,
okay, yeah.
You have me?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I was just saying that, if Trump loses, I think you have to be very concerned about what he's going to do. Is he going to accept defeat, or is he going to claim that he was cheated and you had, millions of illegal immigrants voting against them? Is he going to call his supporters with their assault weapons into the streets? I mean, I think these are very real contingencies that we have to be prepared for. I don't think it's going to rise to the level of launching nuclear war, but I think it's certainly going to be an all-out war on American democracy if Donald Trump feels like he's losing.
Because he would have those months between the election and the inauguration to do whatever he thought he could to deny or to stay in office. I mean, the prospect of removing him bodily from the White House?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he's going to succeed in staying in the White House, but I mean, I think if we've learned one thing about Trump in the last 3+ years is he has no regard for the public interest. He has no regard for American democracy. His only interest is self-preservation. And, a cornered man can do desperate things, and he will still have the vast power of the presidency until January 20th of next year.
Janice Resnick wonders whether this is what an incipient dictatorship looks like.
Well, I think, Trump certainly has the personality traits of a budding dictator, very similar to somebody like Mussolini or Perón or Hugo Chavez or many others. If we were living in 1920s Italy or 1950s Argentina or, 1990s Venezuela, I have no doubt that Trump would be a dictator, but mercifully, we are living in one of the oldest constitutional republics in the world. And so there have been a lot of checks and balances that have prevented Trump from acting on his authoritarian impulses, but there is no question that he has those impulses, and there's no question that he's also already shattered a lot of norms, things that we took for granted that other presidents have done, like releasing their finances and not benefiting financially from their time in office, which Trump has just sneered at that, and he's gotten away with it. So he's really, by his misconduct, is changing the rules of the game.
There's an anonymous question, and you addressed this issue peripherally in your Washington Post column. The question is, why do Orthodox Jews support him? But you talked about one of his comments about Jews and Democrats in the last year.
Well, he's certainly, Trump has postured as somebody who is the most pro-Israel president ever. And in some sense, that's true because he has aligned himself with Bibi Netanyahu and his right-wing government in Israel. And Trump has basically given Netanyahu a blank check to do whatever he wants, including moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, annexing the Golan Heights. Now he's basically given them leave to annex the Israeli West Bank settlements. And so Trump has certainly won some support within the Jewish community, but I suspect that the vast majority of Jews, again, like me, will vote against Trump because at the end of the day, I think, there are other interests of issues of concern to American Jewish voters. But also, I would argue, Trump is really not a true friend of Israel because what he is doing may be helping Netanyahu, but it's not really helping Israel's long-term interest. And, doing things like annexing the West Bank settlements are going to delegitimize Israel as a pluralistic democracy. It's going to make it more of an apartheid state. It's going to make it more of an illegitimate power in the world. And ultimately, that's going to hurt Israel. And I think the other thing that Trump has really done is he's made support for Israel a partisan issue. And that also will hurt Israel because, Republicans are not going to be in perpetual control in the US. And when Democrats come into power, a lot more of them are going to be more skeptical of Israel than they have been in the past because, Trump has identified support with Israel so closely with the Republican political agenda.
And here's a question from Michael to take off on your last point. He says, your expertise is foreign policy. What is your assessment of Trump's foreign policy? And do you agree with David Brooks that Pompeo is the worst Secretary of State ever?
Yes, I definitely agree that Pompeo is the worst Secretary of State ever. The second worst having been Rex Tillerson, who was merely incompetent, but Tillerson was also, I would argue, ethical and moral, which Pompeo was not. and he has done some awful things, including, throwing a U.S. ambassador under the bus, basically giving into Trump's thuggish tactics, engaging in untruthful conduct, insinuating that a Chinese lab weaponized the coronavirus, basically saying or doing anything to help Trump politically. And I think the result has really been a disaster for the United States, because we have lost our leadership role in the world. And I think the New York Times had a comment a few weeks ago that I think is very apt, where they said, this is the first crisis in the last century, in a century or more, in which nobody is looking to the US for leadership. And I think that's very true, because we're not convening the G7, we're not convening the UN, we're not working with our allies. This America First policy that they're pursuing is actually putting our true interests last in hurting our leadership position, hurting our standing in the world. And I think it will be a very tall order if Biden wins in November to try to undo the damage that Trump and Pompeo and other enablers have done, because I think they are inflicting vast long-term damage on America's global leadership role.
Gosh, we have scores of questions for you, which means you're going to have to do this again. But in the meantime,
absolutely,
if you can give us a lay of the land look ahead, what we should be looking for and what we should ignore, and I think they're equally important with this administration.
Well, I would say if possible, try to ignore Trump's distractions. And I'm probably not the best role model in that, because I respond to some of those as well, just because, I'm so outraged when he accuses, Joe Scarborough with zero evidence of having murdered somebody. It's just so crazy. You feel compelled to respond. But in some ways, by responding, we are also kind of playing Trump's game of trying to distract us from what really matters, which is the state of our public health, the state of our economy, the state of our standing in the world. And all of those have declined precipitously under the Trump presidency. And it's possible that from a public health standpoint and from an economic standpoint, we will see some bounce back by November. But I'm pretty certain that if Joe Biden asked that classic question, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Most people will say the answer is no. And I think that is the ultimate reason to remove Donald Trump from office, even disregarding all of the dangers that he poses. And I think the dangers are pretty vast of his anti-democratic agenda in the next 4 years if he is reelected. But just focus on how he performed on his first 4 years. And it is such an unimaginable catastrophe. I just can't imagine who could possibly say this guy deserves another 4 years.
Well, let me ask you then for a very quick reaction to the idea that are more voters wise to him now? Are they on to him?
I do think more voters are on to him. And I think a lot of people naively expected that he would somehow grow in office, that he would be somebody different from the person he had been for the previous 70 plus years of his life. And now we see that's not the case. And so even in the middle of this terrible crisis, his poll numbers are not rising. And so I do think that most people are repulsed by him. Most people are onto him. But, don't forget, most people were repulsed by him in 2016 too. That's why he lost the popular vote by almost 3 million votes, but he still managed to squeak out the election. And so it doesn't matter that most Americans think that he is a failed president or a charlatan. What matters is what a small number of voters in swing states are going to think, and how many of them will actually turn out to vote. That's going to be the whole ballgame.
Well, Max Boot, you can follow him on Twitter @MaxBoot, and you can read his columns in the Washington Post. Thank you. Let's do this again soon.
It's a pleasure. Next time in person.
Yes, let's look forward to that.
Next year in Los Angeles.
You got there ahead of me. Thank you. Congratulations. Also want to thank Janice Kaminer-Resnick, Jews United for Democracy and Justice, and community advocates, of course, and David Lehrer for tonight's program and the entire series. A reminder, they're going to be putting up an image in a minute so you can see them next Wednesday, which is a week from today, America at a Crossroads series, again at 5 p.m., featuring David Brooks of the New York Times with Warren Olney. And of course, you heard that upcoming, there's also David Frum and Peter Beinart of The Atlantic, that publication which Donald Trump called nasty and boring. So you don't want to miss the nasty, boring that. So in any case, those are the upcoming programs. You can see them. You can also go to the website and find out more. So for now, I'm going to quote that sergeant on Hill Street Blues who said, "Let's be careful out there." Good night, everybody.